They said it was just a book. They said it was myth, folklore, religion. But myths don't leave bodies, and folklore doesn't leave records. Under layers of smoke and mirrors, history got rearranged, names rewritten, faces repainted, truth buried deep enough. They thought nobody would, but bones still speak. And evidence remembers what empires try to forget. Scrolls pulled from caves, stones lifted from ruins, medical charts, DNA strands, carbon date up with words written thousands of years ago. They told us it was metaphor, but metaphors don't migrate, and metaphors don't survive captivity. This isn't belief versus science. This is science confirming belief. This isn't faith versus history. This is history catching up to the truth. From Africa to the ancient world, from exile to empire, from scattered people to sealed records, the trail is still there for anyone willing to follow it. They said the past was lost, but it was only hidden, and hidden things always resurface.
This channel isn't here to comfort you.
It's here to document,
to cross-examine,
to put scripture on trial using archeology, medicine, and science.
It needs decoration.
It just needs light. This is smoke and mirrors. We don't repeat narratives.
We expose them.
Matthew chapter 5 verse 17 through 19 says, and I quote, "Do not think that I came to destroy the Torah or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to complete. For truly I say to you, till the heaven and the earth pass away, one yod or one tittle shall by no means pass from the Torah till all be done. Whoever then breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches men so shall be called least in the reign of the heavens. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the reign of the heavens."
Between the silence of prophecy and the thunder of an empire, a struggle for authority reshaped the land of Judea. After centuries of foreign rule, a priestly family rose in rebellion against the Seleucid Greeks, giving birth to what would become known as the Hasmonean dynasty. What began as a fight for religious freedom soon transformed into a political kingdom, one that blurred the lines between priesthood and kingship. As power shifted, so did identity. The ancient Zadokite priesthood, once the legitimate guardians of the temple, found itself challenged and displaced. In their place emerged competing movements: Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, each offering a different vision of Torah, authority, and faithfulness to the covenant. Some adapted to political reality, others withdrew into the wilderness, and some aligned themselves with power within the temple itself. These internal divisions weakened Judea from within, even as Rome advanced from without. By the 1st century BCE, the struggle was no longer only about who rightly served in the temple, but about who would survive as an independent people. This is the story of belief, power, and resistance, and how the conflicts of the Second Temple period paved the way for Roman rule and the world that followed. We are now entering into the 2nd century BC. The manipulation and theft of the Hebrew culture and identity, spearheaded by the now Hellenistic Jews and Antiochus IV, pretty much went unchecked and unchallenged. Well, that is until 167 BC. That's when Antiochus decided to sacrifice a pig on the altar inside of the Second Temple of Jerusalem. The heinous act was the breaking point for the Israelite remnant who were still following Torah. Just a FYI, from this point on, I will refer to the true Jews as Israelites, Hebrews, or Judeans, as not to confuse them with Hellenistic Jews or the Jew transplants that we know today as Jewish people. So, Antiochus's actions started a rebellion by the remnant. This rebellion would be known in history as the Maccabean Revolt or the Hasmonean Revolt. The Hebrew that kicked off this 3-year civil war was Mattathias Hasmoneus. He killed a Jewish man that was ready to follow Antiochus's order and kill a pig on the altar as a sacrifice to Zeus. He also killed one of Antiochus's officers. Mattathias and his sons then escaped to the hills where they began to strategize their attacks. A year into the revolt, Mattathias died. But before he perished, he appointed his son Judas the new leader of the revolt. When Mattathias died in 166 BC, his third son Judas Hasmonean, aka Judas Maccabeus, became the leader of the resistance movement. It was due to Judas's fighting skills that Israelites would come to know this family as the Maccabees, which means hammer. It was actually Judas who recaptured Jerusalem using his guerrilla warfare tactics that he was famously known for. Judas was a man of faith, following the God of his father and his father's father and so forth. He studied Torah religiously. When Antiochus died, he brokered a peace deal with the Syrian general by the name of Lysias. The deal, however, was short-lived, and the war resumed. Judas was killed in battle after over 5 years of being the leader of the resistance. At the end of the 3-year civil war, Judas regained control of Jerusalem by killing Antiochus. This act also ended the Seleucid Empire. And the first thing Judas did was have the temple cleansed and rededicated back to Yahuwah. Matter of fact, that is what Hanukkah means in Hebrew, dedication. In 138 BC, Jewish people would make this rededication a false appointed time and celebration that is still celebrated by Jewish people to date. Hanukkah is not a Hebrew feast, celebration, or appointed time. Judas just had this rededication of the temple back to Yahuwah at the time due to the violations of the temple and the altar. I know. Many use the verse in John chapter 10, verse 22 to justify celebrating this day. However, if you actually read the whole chapter and get context, you will see that the Messiah wasn't actually celebrating that quote-unquote holiday. The holiday was only mentioned to give us a timestamp, context clues, a background, if you will, to what was going on around the Messiah at the time the chapter was written, thus giving us a month and day, letting us know that on December 25th, Yahushua was in the temple, standing on the porch of Solomon, getting accosted by the Jews. When Judas died, his brother Jonathan succeeded him as the general of the revolt. Jonathan, however, wasn't as good of a soldier as Judas was. He was actually a diplomat. So Jonathan befriended the king of the Seleucid Empire, King Alexander Ballas. The king made his quote-unquote friend Jonathan high priest and governor of Jerusalem in 153 or 152 BC. And this title would now be passed down in the Hasmonean bloodline, creating the Hasmonean priest line. Now, this created a problem. The Hasidians, whom had joined in the revolt, were strict law keepers, and according to the Hebraic law, only a descendant of Aaron from the line of Zadok could hold the title of high priest, which the descendants of the Hasmonean line were not. So Jonathan holding that title of high priest was a direct contradiction of Torah. This started dissension amongst the revoltees. It also started a new dynasty known as the Hasmonean dynasty. And according to Josephus in his book titled The Antiquities of the Jews and his book titled The Jewish Wars, we learn that the name Hasmonean comes from Mattathias' great-grandfather, whose surname was Hasmoneus. So, if you are researching this time period in the history books, this is the name you will find this time period under. But if you are looking for this time period in the scriptures, you will find it in the books of the Maccabees, which is the name the Hebrews knew or referred to this bloodline as. This dynasty started in 143 BC, when Simon Maccabeus, the last son of Mattathias, was in rule after his brother Jonathan was murdered. And this dynasty was now independent of the Seleucid Empire. Simon was high priest, governor, and king of Judea. This position was now considered to be hereditary, making Simon the first ruler of the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, this dynasty operated in autonomy from 143 BC to 63 BC, when the Roman general Pompeius had to intervene in what was known as the Hasmonean Civil War, making Judea a client kingdom of Rome. You see, in this point in history, the historians, as well as the author of the second book of Maccabees, recorded this time as quote-unquote, a struggle between Hebrews and Hellenized Jews. The reason for that is because with each new Hasmonean ruler, the further away from Torah they took the people. When Mattathias and his sons started the revolt, it was because they were upholding and following Torah. The new descendants, not so much. They wanted to usher in the Hellenization of Jews. After the death of Simon, the Hasidians pulled out of the revolt to start their own movement. During the Hasmonean dynasty, we see several things take place that are directly responsible for the different religions and the state of their religious beliefs today. Let's start with the Hasidians, or Assyrians, depending on which historical documents you are looking at. Not much is known about their origins, but what is known is they were a group of strict law keepers, and they observed and upheld all the laws, including the quote-unquote oral laws, and they joined the rebellion to assist Mattathias. We also know their purpose for fighting in said rebellion was for the right of quote-unquote religious freedom, because Antiochus Epiphanes' purpose for prosecuting the Israelites was to stop them from worshiping Yah and keeping his laws, especially observing and keeping the Sabbath. And FYI, the Hasidians that we are discussing right now are not the same group of people known today as the Hasidic mysticism, aka the Hasidic Judaism. That group of people formed in the 18th century in Eastern Europe, Poland to be exact. Nor are we discussing the group of people known as the Hasidism of Ashkenaz, also known as German Pietists. That group of people originated in the 12th or 13th century in Germany. The Hasidians we are discussing actually disappeared from history after they left or stopped supporting the Hasmonean heirs. And they stopped supporting the Hasmonean heirs due to the fact that the heirs took the throne and the title of high priest. Because according to Hebrew law, only a descendant from the tribe of Levi, from Aaron's bloodline, by way of Zadok, could hold the title of high priest. And since the descendants of the Hasmonean bloodline did not descend from Levi, Aaron, or Zadok, holding the title was a direct contradiction of Torah. So after Simon was murdered and the Hasidians left the rebellion, they were absorbed into two new upcoming religious groups in the making. one of which history would refer to as the Essenes, and the other is a group of people we know today as the Pharisees. The word Pharisees derives from a Hebrew word that means separated, and the Pharisees started as a social group or movement that represented the common to middle-class people. They later evolved into a quote-unquote school of thought, also known as a school of philosophy. However, how the Pharisees started is not how history would remember them. Around 150 BC, they became known as a religious group, and by 134 BC, they became known as a rabbinical movement. They went from a social movement to some of the most powerful and hypocritical people on the planet. We see their changes take place with each Hasmonean ruler that took the throne. From 134 BC until after the 7th century AD, Judaism was on the rise. After the destruction of the Second Temple, the new teachings of the Pharisees were being spread throughout the whole Hebrew diaspora. At this point in history, there were more Hebrews living outside of Israel, Jerusalem, and Judea than there was living inside of either. Matter of fact, at this point in history, Egypt had become home to most of the Hebrews of the diaspora, which is why Ptolemy commissioned for the Hebrew set-apart scrolls to be translated for his library. Also, the Hellenistic Jews were on the rise, and with their ascension, the Hebrew language was becoming extinct. The Pharisees were combining the teachings of Torah with their own philosophy teachings. You see, the Pharisees enjoyed the attention and the perks that came along with them being identified as a Pharisee. So at this point, they had become known as the unofficial spokesperson for the common people to whatever government that was in power at the time. They made the Hebrew lifestyle and culture into a religion, and then they took control of teaching that said religion out of the hands of the Hebrew priests and made themselves the religious teachers. The Pharisees are responsible for synagogues and churches. They believed that the Most High could and should be worshipped and studied outside of Jerusalem. And it was this belief that prompted them to create institutes of religious studies and worship, also known as seminary schools. So, during the Hasmonean dynasty, we see the birth of the religion, specifically different forms of Judaism. We also see the birth of synagogues, churches, and seminary schools, as well as transliteration of the Septuagint. Because remember, Ptolemy just had the scrolls translated into Greek. So the Hebrews that were only Greek-speaking could read the scrolls, but the Pharisees actually removed and added things to the scrolls. Most of the major changes that the Hebrews experienced during the Hasmonean dynasty were spearheaded by the Pharisees. The Pharisee social group that started in the 2nd century BC was long gone by the time Yahushua was walking the earth in around the 1st century AD. The Pharisees of his time was living in direct contradiction of Torah. While the Torah, aka the Tanakh, was the guide or instruction manual for the Israelites, the Pharisees were teaching what would become known as Pharisaism in the synagogues. After the fall of the Second Temple, it was the Pharisees single-handedly pushing their doctrine in the synagogues, and they were teaching from the Hellenized book, aka the Septuagint. When Ptolemy commissioned for the Hebrew set-apart scrolls to be translated into Greek, he used 72 Hebrews to do it. Some of these Jews were descended from earlier Jew settlers who came to Egypt during and after the Babylonian exile, the Persian period, and the ones that arrived after the death of Alexander in the 300s BC. This is well documented in several Greek historical books written by Greek historians. And if you find a good apocrypha, you can even find the history of how the Septuagint came to be in Egypt in the Library of Alexandria in a book called Epistle of Aristeas. The Epistle of Aristeas, aka the Letter of Aristeas, was written in the 3rd or early 2nd century BC, and it gives an account of the Hebrew captives who had been transported from Judea to Egypt. In these early translations, the name of Yahuwah was preserved, either in Hebrew letters or transliterated to Yahweh, but it was not replaced. We will discuss in a few just when the true name of Yah and Yahushua was replaced in the set-apart scrolls. However, this is also the time period where the Jewish people of the new Pharisee branch began laying the foundation for what would become their new, quote-unquote, instruction manual, aka the Talmud. The Hasmonean Pharisees planted the seed, the methods of debate, oral tradition, and interpretation, and the Talmudic rabbis, centuries later, harvested the fruit, writing down those traditions and expanding them. After Simon Hasmonean was murdered by his son-in-law Ptolemy, son of Ababus, who was the governor of Jericho, not to be mistaken as King Ptolemy of Egypt, John Hyrcanus I took the throne as ruler and high priest. He was the youngest son of Simon, and he was the only one that escaped the ambush that killed his father and brothers. Simon and his sons were murdered by Ptolemy at a banquet in hopes of killing the whole Hasmonean lineage in hopes of seizing the throne. You see, this Ptolemy was a Hellenistic Jew. John escaped the ambush simply because he wasn't in attendance at the banquet. You can read about this in the first book of Maccabees, chapter 16, and in the book titled The Antiquities of the Jews, written by the Jewish historian Josephus. It was John's reign that marked the turning point of the Hasmonean dynasty. You see, unlike his predecessors, John wasn't a devout lawkeeper. He also preferred the Romans over the Greeks. And it was John who ushered in the Jewish sector that would be known in history as the Sadducees. The word Sadducee derives from the word Zadok, which means righteous. The Sadducees were one of the main sects of Judaism during the late Second Temple period, and their name is closely tied to ideas of legitimacy, priesthood, and Zadokite heritage. The Zadokites are descendants from the high priest Zadok, who was the high priest during the times of King David and King Solomon. The Sadducees were the ones who were actually in charge of the temple in Jerusalem during the 2nd century BC. The Sadducees in the 2nd century BC was made up of wealthy aristocrats, wealthy merchants, as well as high priests, and they were all Hellenized. They had a good relationship with the Romans. In conjunction to controlling the temples, they also controlled the Sanhedrin, which was the court system. This was the real reason the Pharisees created the synagogues and the seminary schools, so that they could get from under the Sadducees' watchful eye. The Sadducees only believed in the written Torah. They didn't believe in Yahushua HaMashiach and denied he was who he said he was, and they played a pivotal role in his trial and his death. They denied immortality of the soul as well as bodily resurrection after death. They didn't believe in the existence of the Melachim, aka the angels, either. They lived by the quote-unquote eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth principle. Their lives and political authority was so bound up with temple life that after the temple was demolished by the Romans in 70 AD, the Sadducees ceased to exist. The Seleucid Empire was fighting the Parthian Empire, and because of that war, the Seleucid Empire collapsed and created a power vacuum in the southern Levant. Due to that collapse, it gave John Hyrcanus the power to expand Judea freely. So in 113 BC, taking advantage of the collapse of power and the civil war within what was left of the Seleucid Empire, John Hyrcanus I, aka John Maccabeus, aka John the highest priest of Judea, began the expansion of his empire by conquering Samaria. Now, the Samaritans were a distinct Israelite-related group. They claimed descent from the northern tribes, especially the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, and they emerged after the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom, aka Israel, in 722 BC. Their sacred center was Mount Gerizim near Shechem, which is modern Nablus. They accepted the Torah, but rejected the Jerusalem temple and the Davidic Zadokite priesthood. They had their own priestly line and version of the Pentateuch that is known as the Samaritan Torah. When Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom, we know many Israelites were exiled. But there was a remnant of Israelites that remained in the land. They were mostly from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. And it was these people that became the core ancestry of the Samaritans. Now, after Assyria conquered northern Israel, they resettled people from Babylon, Cutha, Hamath, Abba, and Sepharvaim into the land. This created a mixed population who worshiped Yahuwah after an Israelite priest was sent back to the land, and they also retained some older practices. This mixture of people produced the early Proto-Samaritans. The Samaritans themselves reject being called mixed because they believe that they descended purely from Ephraim and Manasseh, and their priests descend from Aaron's line through Eleazar. They consider themselves the last remnant of ancient Israel. So the Samaritans were not pagans or Hellenists, but an alternative Yahwistic community. They are the continuation of the northern tribes, but shaped by Assyrian resettlement in Samaria. So instead of incorporating them into Jewish life, John punished them for rejecting the Jerusalem temple by destroying their temple that was on Mount Gerizim, thus ending their religious independence. The Bible is very clear that in the 8th to 7th century BC, the new populations brought into Samaria mixed pagan practices with worship of Yahuwah. But the Samaritans of Yahushua's day did not practice paganism. They worshiped Yahuwah alone using their version of the Torah. By the Roman period, which was the 1st century CE, they became a distinct nation. And these were the Samaritans whom Yahushua encounters in the Gospel of John. After John's conquering of Samaria, he set his sights on some of Ishmael's descendants. Most of his descendants resided in the Arabian desert, hence them being known as Arabs, which incidentally means desert people, mixing or nomad. The meaning depends on the language you look up the word Arab under. However, the tribe that John attacked was from Ishmael's oldest son, Nebaioth. The descendants of Nebaioth was known as the Nebatim, and they are mentioned in the books of Isaiah and Maccabees. What makes this tribe unique is that they resided in the kingdom of Edom. They built and resided in the city we know today as Petra. When John conquered these people, he forcefully made them convert to Jewish and to the religion of Judaism. The Nebatim people that has been found dates back to 168 BC. They are several thousand clay tablets that were found in 1840 that now sits in the British Museum. They are known as the Nabatean inscriptions. Now, this particular clay tablet is from King Aretas I. He was a Nabatean Arab king who is mentioned in the second book of Maccabees. The tablet and the scriptures both confirm that the Nabatean people were Ishmaelites, also known as Arabians, and they resided in Edom. In 2015, in Saudi Arabia, a mass grave was discovered. It contained 82,000-year-old skeletons. After research on the bones, the skeletons were found to be Nabatean people. After a reconstruction of the facial bones of a woman, this is what they came up with. Meet Hinat, the Nabatean woman. Fun fact, Nabatean warriors were known for their long wavy hair that they wore feathers in. After John successfully and forcefully converted the Nabatean people to Jewish and Judaism, he moved on to convert actual Edomites. Around 113 through 112 BC, John started his attack on the Idumeans. Now, when John defeated the nation of Idumea, he did something that no other Hebrew ruler before him had ever done. He forcefully converted the people. This action became one of the most significant and controversial events in Hebrew and Jewish history. Josephus wrote about this event in the Antiquities of the Jews. He wrote that Hyrcanus, quote-unquote, subdued all the Idumeans. That means that he defeated their armies, captured their cities, and imposed military control. This was the precondition for forced conversion. Once Hyrcanus conquered the region, he issued a decree. They must either be circumcised, live according to the Jewish Torah, or leave the land forever. This was not a private choice. It was a mandatory national policy. So because the alternative was displacement or living as exiles, they became full citizens of the Jewish nation. They kept the commandments, they practiced Jewish customs, and they were counted as Jews politically, spiritually, and legally. This conversion was forced because they did not have the option to remain Idumean and stay in their homeland. They had to accept being called Jewish and live under Torah or face expulsion from the lands. Hyrcanus used political power, not persuasion. This was not a missionary effort. It was a state policy enforced by a conqueror. Now let's find out exactly who the Idumean people were. So as you can see from the map on the last screen and the map on this screen, the land of Idumea and the land of Edom are one and the same. The Idumeans were descendants of Esau, who was also called Edom. After the Babylonian conquest in the 6th century BC, nomadic Arabian tribes like the Nabateans pushed the Edomites westward, where they resettled in southern Judah, which became known as Idumea in Greek sources. Their homeland lay south and southeast of the Kingdom of Judah, including parts of modern-day southern Jordan and Israel's Negev. So when you see Idumean people in history books or the set-apart text, just know that they are Edomites. When John forced the Edomites to identify as Jewish and for them to accept Judaism as their religion, it marked a turning point in Jewish history. It also changed the face of what the Jewish people now looked like, as well as how they practiced their religion. The conversion also changed the history of the Hebrew people. Although Hyrcanus was aiming for integration, the forced conversion created social tension and resentment. The most famous Idumean was Herod the Great, Rome's client king of Judea. Herod's father, Antipater, was an Idumean official who rose to power under the Hasmoneans. Now, due to the fact that the Sadducees and the Pharisees were both abiding by and practicing Hellenistic views, and both groups integrated the cultures and beliefs from the converts into Hebrew culture. Along with John Hyrcanus's forced conversions, a new religious group emerged, and that group was known as the Essenes. They are responsible for one of the biggest archaeological, historical, and scientific finds to date, known as the Qumran Scrolls, aka the Dead Sea Scrolls. And, like the original Pharisees, they believed in keeping the law to a T. So once a Hasmonean took the title of high priest because according to law, only a descendant of Aaron could hold that title, so they started separating themselves from the rebellion. And once the Pharisees and Sadducees started misinterpreting the law and mixing the Hebrew culture with the beliefs and cultures from the pagan nations, the Essenes started their own community. Most of the original Essenes were descendants from Aaron. When the Essenes did their breakaway from the now Jewish people, they retreated into the Judean desert. The most well-known Essene community lived in Qumran, near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, in what is now known as the West Bank. To be precise, it was about 1 mile or 1.6 kilometers west of the Dead Sea shoreline, roughly 8 to 10 miles, which is between 13 to 15 kilometers south of Jericho, and is situated on a dry plateau overlooking the desert and the water below, close to the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. The Dead Sea area was ideal for their ascetic lifestyle. It was isolated, quiet, and suitable for ritual practices and study. This land was also good for storing scrolls. Due to the arid conditions, it preserved them extremely well. Ancient historians like Philo and Josephus wrote that the Essenes lived in many towns and villages across Judea, not only the desert. These were smaller, more integrated communities, often practicing communal living and strict purity laws. Our knowledge of the Essenes comes primarily from 3 bodies of evidence: classical writers such as Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, and Pliny the Elder, the Hebrew set-apart scrolls and Second Temple literature, and most significantly, the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered near Qumran in the mid-20th century. Central to understanding the Essenes is their relationship to the Zadokites, a priestly lineage descending from Zadok, the high priest during the reigns of King David and King Solomon. In the Hebrew set-apart scriptures, the sons of Zadok are presented as the legitimate and divinely approved priesthood, particularly emphasized in the book of Ezekiel, where the Zadokites are described as those who remained faithful to Yahuwah when other priests went astray. So when the Hasmoneans combined kingship and priesthood, a move that many Hebrews viewed as illegitimate because the Hasmoneans were not descendants of Zadok. This shift created deep theological and political tensions within Judean society. Now, most scholars agree that the Essene community at Qumran either identified themselves as Zadokites or they believed they were led by Zadokite priests. While not every Essene was necessarily a priest, the leadership structure of the community was clearly priest-centered, with Zadokite authority at its core. Their withdrawal into the wilderness was understood as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, particularly Isaiah's call to prepare the way of Yahuwah in the desert. In a scroll called The Community Rule 1QS, chapter 8, verses 12 through 16, they cite Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, to justify withdrawing into the wilderness to prepare the way of Yahuwah through strict Torah observance. In summary, the Essenes were a Second Temple Jewish sect deeply committed to covenantal purity, strict Torah observance, and eschatological hope. Their connection to the Zadokites was not incidental but foundational. They viewed the Zadokite priesthood as the only legitimate priesthood. They rejected the Jerusalem temple leadership of their day, and organized their community around what they believed to be the true, divinely ordained priestly order. The Dead Sea Scrolls stand as enduring testimony to this worldview and provide the strongest evidence linking the Essenes to the Zadokite tradition.
Before we go any further, we are going to discuss the factual things about the quote-unquote Dead Sea Scrolls, aka the Qumran Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are ancient Hebrew manuscripts, not Jewish manuscripts, dating from 250 BC to 70 CE. The scrolls are only classified as Jewish texts because they come from Judea, which is also known as the land of the Jews, and because they were written during the Second Temple period, which is between 516 BC to 70 CE. This is a historical classification, not a claim that the authors followed the later rabbinic traditions. They were discovered between 1947 to 1956 in caves near Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. Over 900 manuscripts were identified, mostly in fragmentary form. Majority of the scrolls were written in Hebrew and Aramaic, with a small number of them written in Greek. Portions of every book of the Hebrew Bible, except Esther, were found. The scrolls never identified themselves with Judaism or called themselves Jews in the rabbinic sense. Instead, they used biblical terms like Israel, Israelites, covenant, sons of Zadok, house of Aaron, and the Yahad, that is, the community. This shows continuity with Hebrew scripture, not later rabbinic identity. The most complete manuscript is the Great Isaiah Scroll. It is nearly identical to the text used today. These manuscripts are 1,000 plus years older than previously known biblical copies. Yes, there were texts like Book of Jubilees, Books of Enoch, Tobit, and Sirach found among the scrolls, as well as a few others. This shows that many Hebrews considered these texts to be authoritative or sacred, even if later they were excluded from the biblical canon. The scrolls survived due to dry desert climate, storage in sealed clay jars, and the caves protected them from light and moisture. Now, authenticity is not disputed in mainstream scholarship. Carbon-14 dating confirms Second Temple era origins. They are among the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Most scholars associate the scrolls with the Hebrew sect, often identified as the Essenes. The reason for that is because of the books found among the scrolls that includes the Essenes' communal living rules, their ritual purity laws, their apocalyptic worldview, and their practices on celibacy for some members of their society. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove the Hebrew Bible was transmitted with extraordinary accuracy. The Qumran Scrolls also illuminate the beliefs about the Messiah, resurrection, angels and spirits, and end times warfare. Bottom line, plain and factual. They are Hebrew language texts written by Israelites. They are categorized today as Jewish because of time and place. They predate Rabbinic Judaism and often oppose it, and they preserve priestly, Zadokite, Torah-centered traditions.
There is an AI program named Enoch, and it was developed by a Groningen University team to analyze and date the Dead Sea Scrolls by examining handwriting, paleography, and radiocarbon data. Trained to detect minute, human invisible patterns, Enoch suggests some scrolls are older than previously thought, potentially shifting their origin back to the 4th or 3rd centuries BC. Researchers trained the AI using a combination of carbon-14 dating results from 30 manuscripts and high-resolution imaging of the handwriting, analyzing thousands of features like stroke angles and letter curvatures. Enoch has analyzed 135 manuscripts so far, and with findings published in PLOS1 indicating that many scrolls may be 50 to 150 years older than previously estimated. The AI indicated that specific texts, such as a segment of the Book of Daniel, might date back to the lifetime of the author. This new technology represents a game changer for archaeology because it is providing a non-invasive way to date ancient texts.
The Dead Sea Scrolls don't just preserve ancient words, they preserve a protest. In the wilderness, a community often associated with the Essenes withdrew from a temple they believed had lost its way. Among them were priests who traced their authority back to the sons of Zadok, men who believed covenant faithfulness mattered more than proximity to power. In caves along the Dead Sea, they copied sacred texts, guarded ancient law, and waited for a restoration they believed could only come through righteousness, not politics. But the Essenes did not retreat because the world was quiet. They withdrew because it was changing. While they purified themselves in the wilderness and prepared for what they believed were the final days, foreign influence tightened its grip on Judea. Rome did not just occupy the land. It reshaped leadership, loyalty, and even the priesthood itself. As the Zadokites' voice echoed through hymns and scrolls, another voice arose in the cities and ports. A king appointed not by lineage or covenant, but by an empire. The future of Israel would no longer be decided in the temple alone, nor in the wilderness caves, but in alliance with Rome. To understand why priestly authority fractured and why communities like the Essenes faded from history, we have to follow the rise of a ruler caught between Israel and the Roman Empire. In the next video, we leave the silence of Qumran and step into the marble halls of power, into the reign of King Herod and the Roman Empire that changed Judea forever.
Thank you for watching my channel today. And if you enjoyed yourself or learned a little something, can you like and share my page? Also, take a minute and hit the subscribe button so you can get notified when I drop a new video. Shalom.
They called it myth. They called it legend. But bones don't lie. And history leaves receipts. This ain't smoke and mirrors. This is science, scripture, and stone. Smoke and mirrors. We expose what was hidden.